The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside Deer Lodge, Montana, and Margaret Dawson pressed her gloved hands against the worn leather seat, watching through the dusty window as a man stepped forward from the small crowd gathered near the station. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from anticipation but from the gnawing fear that had become her constant companion since the fire that had changed everything. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, feeling the weight of the letters inside, the promises of a fresh start that now seemed as fragile as the scarred skin hidden beneath her long sleeves. The year was 1882, and Margaret had traveled from Boston to this remote Montana town with nothing but hope and desperation driving her forward. She had answered an advertisement placed by a rancher named James Newland, a man who sought a wife to share his life on the frontier. His letters had been kind, straightforward, and free of the flowery language that might have made her suspicious. He had told her about his cattle ranch, his modest home, and his simple needs. He had not asked for beauty or grace, only for honesty and a willing heart. Margaret had provided both in her responses, though she had carefully avoided mentioning the burns that covered her left forearm and hand, the permanent reminders of the kitchen fire that had consumed her former employer's townhouse and ended her career as a cook. The door opened, and the driver offered his hand to help her down. Margaret took it, stepping onto the wooden planks of the station platform. The late September air carried the scent of pine and approaching autumn, crisp and clean compared to the coal smoke and crowded streets of Boston. She smoothed her dark green traveling dress and lifted her chin, searching for the man who would become her husband. "Miss Dawson." The voice was deep and uncertain, and Margaret turned to find herself looking up at a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a Montana sky. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and his dark hair was neatly combed back from his forehead. He wore clean clothes, a pressed shirt beneath a leather vest, and his boots, though worn, had been recently polished. "I'm James Newland, Mr. Newland." Margaret dipped her head in greeting, managing a small smile despite the trembling in her limbs. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." He returned her smile, and some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Dawson. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "It was long," she admitted, "but I am grateful to have arrived safely." James gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby, pulled by two sturdy horses. "I have a room reserved for you at the boarding house for tonight. I thought you might want to rest before we head out to the ranch tomorrow. The preacher can marry us in the morning if that suits you." Margaret appreciated his consideration, though the practical arrangement felt strange. In less than 24 hours, she would be married to this stranger. "That sounds very sensible, Mr. Newland. Please call me James." He collected her trunk from the stage-coach driver and loaded it into the wagon with an ease that spoke of years of physical labor. Margaret noticed the strength in his arms, the breadth of his shoulders, and felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with fear. They rode through the main street of Deer Lodge in comfortable silence. The town was small but bustling with activity. A general store occupied one corner, its windows displaying everything from farming tools to bolts of fabric. Across the street, a saloon's doors swung open as a pair of men emerged, laughing at some shared joke. Further down, Margaret spotted a church with a white steeple, a blacksmith's forge sending sparks into the afternoon air, and a modest hotel that doubled as the boarding house James had mentioned. "It is not Boston," James said quietly, following her gaze, "but folks here are good people, hardworking. They look after their own." "I did not come here expecting Boston," Margaret replied. "I came here hoping for something different." He glanced at her, curiosity flickering in his expression, but he did not press for details. Margaret was grateful for that restraint. There would be time enough for explanations, and she dreaded the moment when she would have to reveal the truth about her scars. The boarding house proprietor, a round woman named Mrs. Patterson, greeted them with warm enthusiasm. She showed Margaret to a small but clean room on the second floor, chattering about the weather and the upcoming harvest social. James promised to return in the morning and left Margaret to settle in, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy that made her heart ache with unexpected tenderness. Alone in the room, Margaret unpacked her few belongings and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She slowly peeled off her gloves and stared at her left hand. The burn scars twisted across her skin in angry patterns, puckered and discolored. They ran from her fingertips up past her wrist, disappearing beneath her sleeve. The fire had happened nearly a year ago, but the wound still felt fresh in her memory. She had been preparing dinner for the household when the stove's faulty door had given way, spilling burning coals across the kitchen floor. In her panic to extinguish the flames spreading across the wooden boards, she had plunged her arm into the fire, dragging the heavy pot away from the worst of it. She had saved the house from complete destruction, but the damage to her own body had been severe. The family she had worked for had been grateful at first, paying for a doctor and insisting she rest. But as the weeks passed and her scars became permanent, their gratitude had turned to discomfort. They could not bear to have her scarred hands preparing their meals, could not stand the sight of her damaged skin. They had let her go with a reference letter and a small sum of money, and Margaret had found herself unable to secure another position. No one wanted a disfigured cook, no matter how skilled she might be. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a final desperate option. Margaret had no family left in Boston, no prospects and no future. At 24 years old, she had nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking a chance on a stranger in Montana. She replaced her gloves carefully and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would be married. Tomorrow she would have to tell James the truth. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety, but she pushed it aside. She had come too far to turn back now. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Margaret dressed in her best gown, a simple blue dress with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. She braided her auburn hair and pinned it in a neat coil at the base of her neck, then covered her hands with her gloves once more. In the mirror, she looked pale but composed, a respectable woman ready to begin a new life. James was waiting in the boarding house parlor when she descended the stairs. He wore a clean suit that looked slightly too formal for his frame, as though he had borrowed it for the occasion. His face lit up when he saw her, and he offered his arm with a gentleness that eased some of her worry. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Thank you. You look very handsome as well." They walked to the church together, their footsteps echoing on the wooden boardwalk. The morning was cool and clear, and a few early risers nodded greetings as they passed. At the church, Preacher Anderson waited with his wife, who would serve as a witness along with the general store owner, Mr. Hendricks. The ceremony was brief and practical, the words familiar but weighted with significance. Margaret spoke her vows in a steady voice, promising to honor and cherish this man she barely knew. James repeated his own promises, his deep voice filled with sincerity. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to Margaret's cheek, his lips warm and soft. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Newland," he murmured, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. They signed the marriage certificate, shook hands with the witnesses, and returned to the wagon. James helped her up onto the seat and climbed beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. "It is about an hour's ride to the ranch," he explained as they left town. "The land is not fancy, but it is good grazing country. I have about 300 head of cattle and a handful of horses. There is a barn, a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands who help during busy seasons, and the main house." Margaret listened as he described his property, hearing the pride in his voice. This was a man who had built something with his own hands, who had carved out a place for himself in this wild country. She respected that determination, recognized it in herself. The landscape rolled past in shades of gold and green, punctuated by stands of pine and cottonwood. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow despite the summer that had just passed. A creek wound through a valley, its water sparkling in the sunlight. Margaret had never seen country so open, so vast. It made her feel both small and free. The ranch appeared around a bend in the dirt road. The house was modest, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A covered porch stretched across the front, and the roof looked newly repaired. The barn stood nearby, large and well-maintained, and a corral held several horses that lifted their heads to watch the approaching wagon. Everything spoke of careful attention and hard work. James pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help Margaret descend. "Home," he said, gesturing toward the building. "I know it is not much compared to what you are used to, but I have tried to make it comfortable." "It is perfect," Margaret said honestly, and she meant it. This was more than she had hoped for, more than she deserved after the disaster that had driven her from Boston. Inside, the house was simple but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large table, several chairs, and a stone fireplace that would provide heat during the harsh Montana winters. A door led to a bedroom, which James had clearly prepared for her arrival. The bed was made with a handsome quilt, and fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the windowsill. "I will sleep in the other room," James said, nodding toward a second door Margaret had not noticed. "I added it on last year, thinking I might need the space someday." "I want you to feel comfortable here, Margaret. I know this arrangement is unusual, and I do not expect anything from you until you are ready." His consideration touched her deeply. Margaret turned to face him, her hands clasped in front of her. "You have been very kind, James, more than kind. But there is something I must tell you, something I should have mentioned in my letters." Concern flickered across his face. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath and slowly pulled off her left glove. The scars were vivid in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and she heard James draw in a sharp breath. She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see disgust or disappointment. Instead, she saw only curiosity and sympathy. "What happened?" he asked gently. "A kitchen fire, nearly a year ago. The stove was faulty, and when I was cooking, the door gave way. I tried to stop the fire from spreading, and I burned my arm badly. The scars are permanent." Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I should have told you before, but I was afraid you would withdraw your offer. I understand if you feel I have deceived you." James stepped closer and carefully took her scarred hand in both of his. His touch was warm and steady, and he examined the marks without flinching. "You were injured trying to protect others," he said quietly. "That is nothing to be ashamed of. These scars show courage, not weakness." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. "My former employers could not bear to see them. I lost my position and no one else would hire me. I had nowhere else to turn." "Then I am grateful for that fire," James said, and when she looked at him in shock, he gave her a small, sad smile. "Not for your pain, never that. But if it brought you here to me, then something good came from it. You are my wife now, Margaret. These scars change nothing about that." She wanted to believe him, but years of rejection had made her wary. "You say that now, but what about when you see them every day? What about when I am cooking or working and you cannot avoid looking at them?" "Then I will look at them and remember that I am married to a brave woman," James replied firmly. "Margaret, I have been alone for a long time. I lost my parents to fever when I was 16, and I have spent the last 10 years building this ranch with nothing but my own sweat and determination. I did not ask for a wife because I wanted someone pretty to look at. I asked for a partner, someone who could share this life with me. From your letters, I believed you were that person. Was I wrong?" "No," Margaret whispered. "No, you were not wrong. Then let us move forward together." He released her hand and stepped back, giving her space. "Now, I imagine you are hungry after the journey. Let me show you where everything is in the kitchen, and you can decide if you want to rest or if you would like to prepare something to eat." Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded, grateful for the practical direction. James led her to the kitchen area and opened the cupboards, showing her the supplies he had stocked. There was flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and various preserves. A basket on the counter held fresh eggs, and a crock of butter sat in a cool corner. "I am not much of a cook," James admitted. "I can manage basic meals, but nothing fancy. If you enjoy cooking, I would be grateful for your skills. If you do not, we will figure something else out." Margaret surveyed the kitchen with a professional eye, and then her gaze fell on the stove. Her blood ran cold. It was an old cast iron model, battered and worn, with a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Rust showed around the edges, and when she bent down to look more closely, she could see gaps where the metal had warped. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, poorly maintained stove that had caused her injury. "This stove," she said carefully, her voice tight. "How long have you had it?" James shrugged. "It came with the house when I bought the property 5 years ago. The previous owner left it behind. It is temperamental sometimes, but it gets the job done. It is not safe." The words came out more forcefully than she intended, and James looked at her in surprise. Margaret's heart was racing, memories of the fire flooding back with visceral intensity. "The door does not close properly, and the metal is compromised. If hot coals spill out, they could start a fire. This entire house could burn." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "Like the fire that hurt you?" "Yes." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon. "I cannot cook on this stove, James. I am sorry, but I cannot. Just looking at it makes me feel as though I cannot breathe." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "Then you will not cook on it. I will not ask you to put yourself in danger, Margaret. We will find another way." "But you need a stove," she protested. "Winter is coming and you need hot meals." "I am supposed to be your wife to take care of the household, and I cannot even face the kitchen." "You are my wife," James agreed, "and that means I take care of you too. Let me think on this. There must be a solution." Over the next few days, they fell into a tentative routine. James prepared simple meals over the fireplace, using a metal crane to suspend pots over the flames. It was a clumsy arrangement, inefficient and time-consuming, but he never complained. Margaret helped where she could, chopping vegetables and kneading bread dough, but she stayed as far from the dangerous stove as possible. She explored the ranch during the daylight hours, learning the rhythms of this new life. The 2 ranch hands, Tom and Billy, lived in the bunkhouse and worked from dawn to dusk maintaining fences, tending cattle, and handling the countless tasks that kept a ranch running. They were polite to Margaret, tipping their hats when they saw her and answering her questions about the land and animals with patient good humor. At night, Margaret retired to her bedroom alone, and James disappeared into his own room. They were married in name only, and while James had been nothing but respectful, Margaret found herself wondering what it would be like to truly be his wife. He was handsome and kind, hardworking and honest. She caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the way he spoke gently to his horses, the quick smile that transformed his serious face. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Margaret found James in the barn sketching something on a piece of paper by lantern light. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him, but he looked up and waved her over. "What are you working on?" she asked. "An idea." He turned the paper so she could see. It was a rough drawing of what looked like a stove, but different from any she had seen before. "I have been thinking about what you said, about the stove being dangerous. I want to build you a new one, something safer." Margaret stared at the sketch, her throat tight with emotion. "You want to build me a stove?" "I want to build us a stove," he corrected. "One that will not scare you, one that you can trust. I have been reading up on the newer designs, and I think I can manage it." The blacksmith in town, Mr. Cooper, worked as an apprentice to a stove maker before he came west. "He said he would help me." "That would be expensive," Margaret said slowly. "Surely you have more important things to spend money on." James set down his pencil and looked at her intently. "Margaret, what could be more important than making sure my wife feels safe in her own home? You have barely eaten this past week, and I know it is because you are afraid to be in the kitchen. I will not have you living in fear. We are partners in this, and partners take care of each other." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes once again. Since arriving in Montana, she had cried more than she had in the entire previous year, but these were different tears. These came from a place of gratitude and growing affection. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know what else to say except thank you. You do not need to say anything." James stood and rolled up his sketch. "Come on, let us go back to the house. I want to show you something else." They walked across the yard together, and Margaret noticed how close James stayed to her side, not quite touching but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. In the house, he lit several lamps and pulled out a wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with string. "These are all the letters you sent me," he said, untying the bundle. "I have read them so many times I practically have them memorized. You told me about growing up in Boston, about learning to cook from your grandmother, about your love of books and music. You told me about your dreams of seeing the mountains and living somewhere you could watch the sunrise without buildings blocking the view. You shared yourself with me through these words, Margaret, and I felt like I knew you before you ever stepped off that stagecoach." He handed her one of the letters, and Margaret recognized her own handwriting. She had poured so much hope into these pages, never really believing that anyone would care about her small dreams and quiet wishes. "I did not tell you everything," she said softly. "I left out the most important part. You told me what you were ready to share. The rest you revealed when you were brave enough to show me the truth. That took courage, Margaret, more courage than most people have." She looked up at him, seeing the genuine admiration in his eyes, and something shifted in her chest. This man, this stranger who had become her husband, saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. He looked past her scars to the person beneath, and he valued what he found there. "I want to be a true wife to you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I want this to be a real marriage, James, if you want that too." His expression softened, and he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and Margaret leaned into the touch. "I have wanted that since the moment I saw you," he admitted. "But I did not want to rush you. I thought you might need time to adjust, to feel comfortable here." "I do feel comfortable." Margaret placed her hand over his, no longer hiding her scars. "I feel safer here than I have felt anywhere else. You make me feel safe." James leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. Margaret did not pull away. She tilted her face up to meet his kiss, and when their lips touched, she felt something ignite inside her that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with hope. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as they both surrendered to the moment. James wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her closer, and Margaret slid her hands up to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to build you the best stove in Montana," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise you that," Margaret laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy. "I believe you." That night, Margaret did not sleep in her own room. She lay beside James in his bed, wrapped in his arms, feeling more content than she had in years. They did not rush into intimacy, choosing instead to savor the simple pleasure of being close to each other. James held her as though she were precious, his hands gentle on her scarred skin, and Margaret finally understood what it meant to be cherished. The next morning, James rode into town to speak with Mr. Cooper, the blacksmith. He took his sketches and a list of materials, determined to turn his vision into reality. Margaret spent the day cleaning the house more thoroughly, making it truly hers. She rearranged the furniture in the main room, hung curtains she had brought from Boston, and organized the kitchen supplies in a way that made sense to her. She avoided the old stove, still unable to look at it without feeling a surge of panic, but she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have a safe one, a stove she could trust. James returned in the late afternoon with a wagon full of materials. Sheets of metal, fire bricks, iron rods, and various tools Margaret did not recognize. Mr. Cooper followed on horseback, and the two men began unloading everything near the barn. "We will build it out here first," James explained when Margaret came out to watch. "Once it is complete and we have tested it thoroughly, we will move it into the house and remove the old one." Mr. Cooper was a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle demeanor. He studied James's sketches with approval, making occasional suggestions and pointing out potential improvements. "Your husband has a good eye for design," he told Margaret. "This stove will be solid and safe. The door will have a double latch system, and we are going to reinforce all the seams so there is no chance of hot coals escaping." "How long will it take to build?" Margaret asked. "A few weeks, working on it in our spare time," James said. "Mr. Cooper has agreed to come out in the evenings after he closes his shop, and I will work on it during the day when I am not needed with the cattle." "I will help however I can," Margaret offered, and she did. Over the following weeks, she became an integral part of the project. She learned to rivet metal plates together under Mr. Cooper's patient instruction, helped measure and cut fire bricks, and held pieces in place while James welded joints. Her scarred hands proved to be an asset rather than a hindrance. The damaged skin was less sensitive to heat, allowing her to work close to the welding torch without discomfort. As they worked side by side, Margaret and James talked. They shared stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, and the small observations that make up the fabric of daily life. Margaret learned that James had lost his parents to scarlet fever when he was barely more than a boy, that he had worked on other people's ranches for years, before saving enough to buy his own land. He told her about the harsh winters, the summer droughts, the constant struggle to keep his cattle healthy and his ranch profitable. But he also told her about the satisfaction of building something lasting, of knowing that every fence post he drove into the ground was part of a legacy he was creating. In turn, Margaret shared more about her life in Boston. She told him about her grandmother, an Irish immigrant who had taught her the old recipes and the importance of feeding people with love as well as skill. She described the family she had worked for, their initial kindness and eventual rejection. She spoke about the fire with more detail than she had before, describing the heat, the fear, the searing pain that had accompanied her injury. "I thought I was going to die," she admitted one evening as they sat together working on the stove's inner chamber. "The pain was so intense that I could not think, could not move. One of the other servants dragged me away and plunged my arm into a bucket of water. The doctor said I was lucky to keep my hand." James looked at her scarred fingers, which were currently holding a metal rod steady while he tightened a bolt. "You were more than lucky. You were strong, stronger than you give yourself credit for." "I did not feel strong. I felt broken. Broken things can be mended." He gestured to the stove taking shape before them. "This is proof of that. We are taking broken pieces and making them into something better than they were before." Margaret realized he was not just talking about the stove. He was talking about her, about them, about the way they were building a life together from the fragments of their separate pasts. The stove slowly came together, piece by careful piece. Mr. Cooper showed them how to construct the firebox with fire bricks that would contain the heat safely, how to design the flue system to draw smoke efficiently, how to create a door that sealed tightly and could be opened without risk of spilling burning contents. James added his own innovations. A temperature gauge salvaged from a broken oven he found at the general store, a removable ash pan for easy cleaning, and a flat-top surface large enough to accommodate multiple pots at once. As the October air grew colder and the leaves turned gold on the cottonwoods, the stove neared completion. Margaret found herself growing excited in a way she had not anticipated. This was not just a cooking appliance. It was a symbol of everything her new life represented. It was safety, consideration, partnership, and love made tangible. On a crisp morning in early November, James and Mr. Cooper declared the stove ready for testing. They built a small fire in the firebox and watched carefully, checking for any signs of smoke leaking from the seams or heat escaping where it should not. The stove performed perfectly, the flames dancing behind the secure door, the metal heating evenly across the cooking surface. "She is a beauty," Mr. Cooper declared with satisfaction. "One of the finest stoves I have had the pleasure of working on. You should be proud, Mrs. Newland." Margaret circled the stove, examining it from every angle. The metal gleamed in the morning light, and the carefully crafted door fit so precisely that not even a sliver of light showed around its edges when closed. She reached out and touched the warm surface, feeling none of the fear that had gripped her around the old stove. "It is perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." James came to stand beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. "Are you ready to cook on it?" She took a deep breath and nodded. "I am ready." They moved the new stove into the house that afternoon, positioning it carefully in the kitchen area. Tom and Billy helped haul the old stove out, loading it onto a wagon to be taken away. Margaret watched it go with profound relief, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That evening, Margaret cooked her first real meal in her new home. She made a pot roast with vegetables from the root cellar, biscuits with butter and honey, and an apple pie from fruit James had purchased in town specifically for this occasion. The stove heated evenly and responded beautifully to her adjustments, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythms of cooking. Her scarred hands moved with practiced efficiency, chopping, stirring, and seasoning without conscious thought. When she called everyone to dinner, James, Tom, and Billy crowded into the house with eager anticipation. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air, and Margaret felt a surge of pride as she set the food on the table. "This looks incredible," James said, his eyes shining with admiration. "It smells even better," Tom added, already reaching for a biscuit. They ate with enthusiasm, praising every bite, and Margaret basked in their genuine appreciation. This was what she had missed, what the fire had taken from her. The simple joy of feeding people she cared about, of using her skills to create comfort and nourishment. After Tom and Billy returned to the bunkhouse, James helped Margaret clean up, drying dishes while she washed them. They worked in companionable silence, their movements synchronized from weeks of collaborating on the stove project. "Thank you," Margaret said as she dried her hands on a towel. "For building the stove, for understanding why I needed it, for making me feel at home here." James set down the dish he was holding and turned to face her. "You are home, Margaret. This is where you belong with me." She looked up at him, seeing the love in his eyes, and felt her heart swell with answering emotion. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out with surprising ease. "I did not expect to, at least not so quickly, but I do. I love you, James Newland." His face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Margaret laughed, clutching his shoulders, feeling giddy and young and deliriously happy. "I love you too," he said when he set her down. "I have loved you since I read your first letter, since you told me about watching the sunrise and dreaming of mountains. I loved the person I met in those letters, and I love the woman you are even more." They kissed, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. They had built something together, had created a foundation of trust and respect and genuine affection. Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she was meant to be. That winter was the happiest of Margaret's life. Snow fell in thick blankets across the Montana landscape, turning the ranch into a pristine wonderland. James taught her to ride, patiently guiding her through the basics until she could handle a horse with confidence. They rode together across the white fields, checking on the cattle and ensuring the fences remained intact despite the heavy snow. The new stove proved its worth 100 times over. Margaret cooked hearty stews and soups, baked bread that filled the house with warmth and delicious smells, and even attempted more complicated dishes she had not dared try since the fire. The fear that had haunted her for so long gradually faded, replaced by a renewed love of her craft. She and James settled into true married life, sharing not just a home but a bed, a future, and the deep intimacy that comes from choosing each other every single day. James proved to be a tender and attentive husband, and Margaret discovered a passion and joy in their physical relationship that surprised her. They made love by firelight and morning sun, learning each other's bodies with patience and delight. As winter turned to spring, Margaret realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of excitement and fear. She told James one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "A baby," he repeated, his eyes going wide. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Sometime in the early autumn, I think." James let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms again, holding her close and laughing with pure happiness. "We are going to be parents." "Margaret, this is the best news I could possibly imagine." They spent the spring preparing for the arrival of their child. James built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until the surface was smooth as silk. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her scarred fingers working the needle with careful precision. Tom and Billy, upon hearing the news, took over more of the heavy ranch work, insisting that James spend his time helping Margaret and getting ready for fatherhood. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Margaret bloomed with health. The summer of 1883 was mild and beautiful, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and the cattle growing fat on the lush grass. Margaret spent her days tending a garden she had planted near the house, preserving vegetables for the coming winter, and cooking meals that nourished both her body and her growing child. On a warm evening in early September, Margaret went into labor. James sent Tom racing to town to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, who had delivered half the babies in Deer Lodge. While they waited, James stayed by Margaret's side, holding her hand and offering encouragement as the contractions grew stronger. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her medical bag and calm competence, taking charge of the situation with the ease of long experience. She shooed James out of the bedroom, but he refused to go far, pacing in the main room and listening to Margaret's labored breathing with growing anxiety. The labor lasted through the night and into the early morning hours. James wore a path in the wooden floor with his pacing, praying to a God he was not sure he believed in, that Margaret would be safe, that the baby would be healthy, that everything would be all right. Finally, as the sun rose over the mountains, a thin cry split the air. James froze, his heart pounding, and then Mrs. Patterson opened the door with a tired smile. "Come meet your son," she said. James rushed into the bedroom and found Margaret propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing with joy. In her arms, she held a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had sewn. The baby's face was red and scrunched, and he waved tiny fists in the air as he cried. "Our son," Margaret said softly, looking down at the infant with wonder. "James, we have a son." James sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers wrapped around his, gripping with surprising strength, and James felt tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son's face, Margaret said, "I would like to name him David after my father, David Newland." "David," James repeated, tasting the name. "I like it. Hello, David. Welcome to the world, son." The baby stopped crying and seemed to look at James, his unfocused eyes blinking in the morning light. James marveled at the tiny perfection of him, the miniature nose and rosebud mouth, the dark hair covering his head. This was his son, his family, the future he and Margaret were building together. Mrs. Patterson stayed for several days, helping Margaret recover and teaching both new parents the basics of infant care. David was a healthy, hungry baby who seemed to have his father's lungs and his mother's determined temperament. He kept them awake at night with his cries, but rewarded them with moments of peaceful contentment that made the exhaustion worthwhile. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of red and gold, life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret balanced caring for David with her household duties, finding joy in both. She would cook dinner with the baby strapped to her chest in a sling, swaying gently to soothe him while she stirred pots on the stove that had become such an important symbol of her new life. The stove that James had built for her, the stove that represented his love and consideration, had become the heart of their home. David grew quickly, reaching for objects by winter and crawling by the following spring. James would come in from working the ranch to find his son exploring the house with single-minded determination, and Margaret laughing as she tried to keep him out of mischief. The house rang with the sounds of family life. David's giggles, Margaret's singing as she worked, James's deep voice reading stories aloud in the evenings. On their second wedding anniversary, James surprised Margaret with a gift. He led her outside to where a new structure stood near the house, a small building with large windows and a sturdy door. "What is this?" Margaret asked, confused. "Your own kitchen," James explained, pride evident in his voice. "I know the house gets crowded sometimes, especially now that we have David, and I thought you might like a separate space for your cooking. I built another stove, using what I learned from the first one. This one is even better, I think. There is also a large work table, storage for your supplies, and space to preserve food when the harvest comes in." Margaret walked into the new building, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating a beautifully organized space that had been designed specifically for her needs. The new stove stood against one wall, identical to the one in the house but equipped with additional features. A warming oven on top, a water reservoir on the side, and a built-in rack for hanging pots. "James," she breathed, overcome with emotion, "this is too much." "It is not nearly enough," he replied, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "You deserve a place where you can work without distraction, where you can practice your craft. I have been thinking about the future, about what we want for this ranch. We have good land, and we are making a decent living with the cattle, but I have been wondering if there might be other opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, your cooking is the best I have ever tasted. Tom and Billy agree, and so does everyone else who has been lucky enough to sample your food. What if you started selling some of your baked goods in town? Bread, pies, maybe some of those preserves you make." I spoke with Mrs. Patterson, and she thinks the boarding house guests would love to have fresh bread delivered regularly. The general store might take some of your goods on consignment too. Margaret considered the idea, turning it over in her mind. She had never thought of her cooking as a potential business, but the prospect excited her. "Do you really think people would buy what I make?" "I know they would. I have seen how people react to your food, Margaret. You have a gift, and there is no reason that gift cannot help support our family while also bringing joy to others." And so Margaret began a new venture, baking in her beautiful new kitchen and selling her goods in town. James had been right about the demand. Within weeks, she had more orders than she could fill, and she found herself rising before dawn to prepare bread, pies, and pastries for her growing list of customers. The extra income allowed them to make improvements to the ranch, hire additional help, and save for David's future. As the years passed, their family grew. 2 years after David's birth, Margaret delivered twin daughters, Emily and Grace. The birth was more difficult than her first, and James spent a terrifying 12 hours convinced he was going to lose his wife. But Margaret proved her strength once again, surviving the ordeal and recovering with the resilience that had become her defining characteristic. The twins were as different as night and day despite sharing a face. Emily was bold and adventurous, always finding trouble, while Grace was quieter and more thoughtful, content to sit and observe the world around her. David took his role as big brother seriously, watching over his sisters with protective devotion. The house rang with laughter and chaos, the sounds of a family thoroughly engaged in the business of living. Margaret cooked in her kitchen, creating not just food but memories. She taught David to knead bread, showing him how to fold and press the dough. She let the twins help measure ingredients, their small hands carefully pouring flour into bowls while she supervised. The stove that had started everything, the one James had built for her during their first year of marriage, became something of a legend in Deer Lodge. People would visit the ranch just to see it, marveling at its innovative design and safety features. Several ranchers commissioned Mr. Cooper to build similar stoves for their own homes, and the blacksmith found himself with a thriving side business creating custom cooking appliances. James expanded the ranch gradually, purchasing additional land when it became available and increasing their herd. He had a natural talent for ranching, and his cattle were among the healthiest in the region. But he never let his work consume him completely. He always made time for Margaret and the children, understanding that the family they had built together was more important than any amount of wealth or success. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, James and Margaret would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. They would talk about their day, share their hopes and concerns, and marvel at how far they had come from that first awkward meeting at the stagecoach station. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" James asked one such evening, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "Never," she replied without hesitation. "That decision was the best thing I ever did. It brought me to you, to this life, to our family. How could I regret any of that, even with everything you went through, the fire, the scars, the pain?" Margaret looked down at her left hand, which rested on James's knee. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer filled her with shame. They were part of her story, part of the journey that had led her to this moment. "Especially because of all that," she said firmly. "The fire changed my life, but not in the way I thought it would. Yes, it hurt me, and yes, it cost me my position and my confidence. But it also set me on the path that led here. If I had not been injured, I never would have become a mail-order bride. I never would have come to Montana, never would have met you, never would have had our children. Those scars are not a tragedy, James. They are a gift because they gave me you." James pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Newland, more than I can ever express." "I love you too, always." The years continued to roll by, bringing both challenges and triumphs. Winters were harsh, and there were times when they struggled to keep the cattle alive through bitter cold and deep snow. Summers brought droughts that turned the grass brown and made every drop of water precious. But they faced everything together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the good. David grew into a tall, strong young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's kind heart. He took naturally to ranching, and by the time he was 16, he was running cattle operations alongside James. Emily proved to have a head for business, taking over the management of Margaret's baking enterprise and expanding it beyond anyone's expectations. Grace discovered a love of learning and became a teacher, educating the children of Deer Lodge in a small schoolhouse built by the community. Margaret's reputation as a cook grew to near legendary status. People traveled from neighboring towns to purchase her baked goods, and she published a small cookbook of her recipes that sold out within weeks. The initial scarred hands that had once been a source of shame became a symbol of her journey, and she spoke openly about the fire and her recovery, encouraging others who had suffered injuries or setbacks. On their 20th wedding anniversary, James surprised Margaret with a trip. He arranged for Tom, now the ranch foreman, to manage things while they were gone, and he took Margaret to San Francisco. It was her first time seeing the ocean, and she stood on the shore with tears streaming down her face, awed by the vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon. "Thank you," she told James that night as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the bay. "Thank you for showing me the world, for building me that stove, for loving me when I could not love myself. Thank you for everything." "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely rancher," James replied. "Thank you for saying yes, for coming to Montana, for building this life with me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, eager to see their children and resume their normal routines. The house they had built together, literally and figuratively, welcomed them home. The kitchen Margaret had used for 20 years still smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, and the stove James had built still functioned perfectly, a testament to his skill and dedication. As they entered their later years, James and Margaret watched with pride as their children grew into capable adults. David married a rancher's daughter from the neighboring property, and they built a house on the far edge of the Newland land. Emily married a merchant from Deer Lodge, and together they opened a restaurant that served Margaret's recipes. Grace married a lawyer and moved to Helena, though she visited frequently, bringing her own children to spend summers on the ranch. The ranch house filled with grandchildren, and Margaret found herself baking cookies and telling stories to a new generation. She taught her grandchildren to cook just as she had taught her own children, passing down not just recipes but values. The importance of hard work, the power of perseverance, the necessity of kindness. James, now silver-haired but still strong, continued to work the ranch with David's help. He took pride in what they had built, in the legacy they would leave behind. The Newland Ranch was known throughout Montana as a model of successful ranching and strong family values. On a warm summer evening, when Margaret was 68 and James was 72, they sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, and the sound of their grandchildren playing in the yard drifted through the air. "We did it," Margaret said softly. "We built something lasting." "We did," James agreed, taking her scarred hand in his weathered one. "We took broken pieces and made something beautiful." Margaret looked at the hand he held, seeing not the scars but the story they represented. Every mark was a reminder of where she had been, what she had overcome, and who she had become. She had been a frightened young woman with nothing to offer but her skills and her hope. She had found a man who saw past her injuries to her worth, who had literally built her the tools she needed to heal and thrive. "I wish I could go back and tell that scared girl stepping off the stage coach that everything would be all right," Margaret mused. That the burns that seemed like the end of everything were actually the beginning. "She would not have believed you," James said with a smile. "Some things you have to discover for yourself. I suppose you are right." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, content in the simple pleasure of his presence. "But I would have told her anyway. I would have told her that she was going to find love, build a family, and create a home filled with warmth and joy. I would have told her that the man who answered her letter would not just accept her scars but would see them as proof of her courage. And I would tell the lonely rancher who placed that advertisement that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine," James added. "That a woman from Boston was going to teach him what it meant to truly love someone, to be a partner and a father and a better man than he had ever thought possible." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue. Around them, the ranch settled into evening quiet, the cattle lowing softly in the distance, the horses nickering in their stalls. The land they had worked, the home they had made, the family they had raised, all of it was a testament to what two people could accomplish when they chose to build something together. Inside the house, the stove that had started it all sat cold and quiet, waiting for morning when Margaret would fire it up again to make breakfast for visiting grandchildren. That stove, built with love and care during their first year of marriage, had become more than just an appliance. It was a symbol of everything their marriage represented: safety, consideration, partnership, and the willingness to create solutions rather than accept defeat. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, James helped Margaret to her feet, and they walked inside together. Their home welcomed them with familiar smells and comfortable surroundings, every corner holding memories of the life they had shared. They prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, moving around each other in perfect synchronization. That night, lying beside the man who had been her salvation and her greatest joy, Margaret reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The fire that had scarred her body had also freed her from a life of limitations. The mail-order bride advertisement that had seemed like a desperate last resort had actually been the doorway to everything she had ever wanted. And the cowboy who had built her a safer stove had given her so much more than a way to cook without fear. He had given her a reason to hope, to dream, and to believe in happy endings. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," James replied, his arm tightening around her. Always and forever. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and deeply loved, Margaret knew that her story had ended exactly as it should, with love, with family, and with the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The scars on her arm would remain until her dying day, but they no longer represented pain or loss. They represented survival, resilience, and the courage to take a chance on a stranger who became her everything. The mail-order bride from Boston and the Montana rancher had built more than a stove together. They had built a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of compassion, determination, and the willingness to see past surface imperfections to the treasure beneath. Their story would be told for generations in Deer Lodge, Montana. The tale of the woman with the scarred hands and the man who built her not just a safer stove, but a safer place to land, to heal, and to flourish into the person she was always meant to be.